For nearly 2 centuries, the story of Jane Eyre and Edward Rochester has been called one of the greatest love stories in literature. And precisely because of this, it has attracted an enormous weight of romantic interpretation. For some readers, it's the story of the brooding man saved by love. For others, it's the story of a strong woman who sees through the gruffness and cynicism to the living person beneath. But read Brontë's novel as psychological drama, and one thing becomes clear. The relationship between Jane and Rochester is considerably more complex and more troubling than a surface reading suggests. This is not the story of an emotionally healthy couple who simply found each other. It's a collision between two people whose personalities were forged inside chronic loneliness, emotional deprivation, and broken intimacy. Which is precisely why their connection carries such intensity from the start. What they recognize in each other is not an ideal romantic partner, but someone who also exists slightly apart from the rest of the world. And yet Brontë's novel resists both the fairy tale reading and the reductive, toxic relationship label. Its psychological power lies in holding both poles simultaneously. The bond between Jane and Rochester becomes a source of profound emotional closeness, and at the same time carries real risks of dependency, boundary dissolution, and painful merger. Especially in the novel's first half, where love is constantly entangled with the fear of loss, the need for control, and internal instability. This is why the central event of the novel turns out not to be the love story itself, but the gradual transformation of what that love is built on. Brontë shows what happens to a bond when two people are forced through loss, vulnerability, and the destruction of their old ways of existing. In this sense, Jane Eyre is less a novel about love as salvation than an inquiry into what happens to intimacy when two deeply wounded people try to learn how to be together, without destroying each other with their own fear. The primary reason the story of Jane and Rochester makes such a strong impression is that their connection forms long before any romantic closeness develops. They recognize each other almost immediately, but the recognition is built not on appearance, social standing, or conscious attraction. What matters far more is this: both very quickly register in the other a familiar sensation of internal isolation. Jane and Rochester both exist slightly outside the surrounding world, though they arrive at this condition by entirely different roads. Jane's loneliness was shaped by chronic emotional rejection. At Gateshead, her presence was experienced as an inconvenience. At Lode, what was valued was submission, self-control, and the surrender of personal needs. The result is a very specific psychological formation: high internal autonomy, the habit of relying on herself, and the constant observation of her own feelings rather than their free expression. She learns early to live without emotional support from other people, which is why her personality reads as calm and self-contained, even as an enormous need for closeness and recognition lives underneath. But this internal restraint is not emotional passivity. On the contrary, her psyche is extraordinarily alive, observant, and sensitive to any trace of performance or power. From childhood, she trained herself to read the emotional atmosphere around her, because her psychological survival depended on it. Which is exactly why Jane so quickly registers Rochester's internal instability, and almost immediately begins to perceive the contradiction between his outward harshness and the vulnerability it covers. Rochester's loneliness is differently constructed. His personality formed not through suppression, but through chronic distrust of people and an internal fracture between the need for closeness and the terror of it. The betrayal by his family, the catastrophic marriage to Bertha, the emotionally destructive entanglements that followed, all of it gradually produces in him the conviction that relationships are inevitably bound to either deception or the loss of freedom. By the time he meets Jane, Rochester already exists inside a state of constant internal tension, desperately needing emotional contact and simultaneously unable to feel safe within it. which is why their first encounter is psychologically so significant. Rochester appears before Jane not as the imposing master of Thornfield, but as a man quite literally knocked off his habitual position of control. He falls from his horse, finds himself irritated, vulnerable, and forced to accept help from a stranger. For someone accustomed to regulating his own anxiety through dominance and command of his environment, this situation is close to humiliating. But Jane's response matters even more. She doesn't behave like a frightened girl in the presence of a wealthy lord. This connects directly to her past. For most women of her position, Rochester's sharpness would have been alarming and off-putting. But Jane grew up in an emotionally harsh environment where coldness, irritability, and psychological roughness were simply the norm. She doesn't experience his difficult character as something exceptional or overwhelming. More than this, his blunt manner unexpectedly releases some of her internal tension. Around impeccably refined people, Jane typically feels her own social unsuitability acutely and begins monitoring every word she says. Rochester dismantles the usual Victorian distance himself, and because of this, Jane finds herself speaking more freely and naturally in his company. It's crucial that there is almost no idealization in their early exchange. Jane doesn't perceive Rochester as a romantic ideal or an unattainable figure. From the very beginning, she registers his difficult character, his sharpness, his mood swings, his inner darkness. But she doesn't respond to it with the usual combination of fear and awe. She responds directly to the person, not to his position or his charisma. Her famous "no," when asked whether she finds him handsome, is the precise measure of this. She simply states what she perceives. For Rochester, this is a rare experience of contact in which the other person isn't trying to calibrate themselves to his expectations. This is what begins to pull him in most powerfully. Rochester is accustomed to relationships built either around social roles or around power, money, and mutual manipulation. And suddenly before him stands someone who makes no effort to impress him, who doesn't flatter him, who doesn't begin to emotionally orbit around him. Jane remains internally stable, even inside his heavy emotional intensity. For someone with as damaged a history of intimacy as Rochester, this is a genuinely new psychological experience. What emerges between them, almost from the start, is a rare type of contact. For the first time, each encounters someone beside whom they can let their habitual defensive construction relax, even slightly. And this is what makes their bond so charged, well before it becomes a love story in any conventional sense. One of the central reasons the relationship between Jane and Rochester carries such force is that most people, placed beside someone like him, would gradually lose themselves. Edward Rochester is a man of extraordinarily high emotional intensity. His psyche tolerates uncertainty, distance, and the feeling of losing control over closeness very poorly. Relationships therefore quickly become for him not simply a space of love, but a mechanism for regulating his own internal state. This matters enormously. Rochester cannot exist in an emotionally neutral mode. His anxiety constantly demands action, tests, provocations, the emotional roller coaster, control over the situation. He draws Jane in, then pushes her away, becomes unexpectedly frank, then retreats back into sharpness and psychological game playing. This pattern is characteristic of disorganized attachment, the attachment style in which a person simultaneously craves closeness and experiences it as a threat to their own safety. Which is why his love so quickly begins to take on the quality of absorption. It isn't enough for Rochester to simply be loved. He needs to feel that the bond is guaranteed, that the other person won't disappear, won't betray him, won't finally destroy what remains of his stability. But since no absolute guarantee of closeness exists, his psyche attempts to substitute for it through control. Hence the emotional tests, the manufactured jealousy, the theatrical provocations, the pressure, the constant attempt to manage the emotional climate of the relationship. The most exhausting thing about people like this isn't their bluntness or their eruptions. Far more dangerous is their capacity to gradually make their own internal state the center of the entire relationship. Their anxiety begins to set the emotional weather. Their pain occupies all the available space. Their crises become the primary reality of the bond. And if the person beside them has weak boundaries, they begin, slowly, to live inside someone else's psyche, losing contact with their own. This is precisely where Jane's figure becomes essential. From the beginning, she doesn't idealize Rochester, and this is one of her most important departures from the classic romantic heroine. Jane sees his chaos, his emotional instability, his manipulation, his contradictions, his moral ambiguity, and she reads all of this almost intuitively, long before the revelation about Bertha. But she doesn't respond by dissolving before him or surrendering her own subjecthood. Psychologically, this is critical. People with pronounced emotional intensity often produce an effect of psychological gravity, in which the partner gradually begins to orbit around their states, their needs, their crises. Jane, however, retains the capacity to remain a distinct person even inside a very powerful attachment. This stability is sustained by her extraordinarily strong sense of inner dignity. For Jane, love never becomes a justification for total self-abandonment. Even at the height of her emotional involvement, she retains a felt sense of her own boundaries and her right not to betray herself for the sake of the relationship. Which is why her attachment to Rochester is so deep, without becoming total submission. Much of this is traceable to the specific character of her own formation. Jane grew up under conditions of chronic emotional suppression. At Gateshead, her feelings were treated as a problem. At Lode, what was valued was submission, discipline, and self-denial. This kind of experience frequently develops in a person a heightened capacity to sustain emotional pressure without losing internal structure. Jane learned very early to rely on her own inner world because external emotional support was almost never available. But it's important not to romanticize her resilience. Jane is not the woman who can fix a difficult man. She too gradually begins to be pulled into a dangerous dynamic of emotional merger. This is most visible in the aftermath of the Bertha revelation. Rationally, Jane understands the situation is catastrophic. Emotionally, she remains deeply attached to Rochester. Her internal conflict reaches such intensity that she describes her own departure almost as an act of self-amputation. "You shall tear yourself away, none shall help you. You shall, yourself, pluck out your right eye, yourself cut off your right hand." This is a psychologically precise description of separating from someone who has become the central figure of your emotional life. Her flight from Thornfield, then, cannot be reduced to Victorian morality or wounded pride at being deceived. At a deeper level, it is an instinctive act of psychic self-preservation. Jane cannot yet fully articulate what is happening, but her psyche has already registered the threat. If she stays, her life will begin to organize itself entirely around Rochester's emotional chaos. What is especially telling is that Rochester, in this moment, effectively tries to make Jane responsible for his own existence. His lines about her condemning him to a terrible life and death are not romantic excess. They are a textbook attempt to transfer responsibility for one's emotional state onto another person. His near-instant slide, when Jane won't let him lean on her, into the conviction that her love had always been about his status. This, too, is characteristic. For someone with this depth of internal shame, this shift is entirely typical. The psyche protects itself from humiliation by devaluing the other person's motives. But it is Jane's departure that breaks Rochester's script. For the first time in his life, he encounters the fact that love does not guarantee possession. That another person cannot be held by the force of your feeling, your suffering, your dependency, or your emotional pressure. That the other person has their own will, their own limits, and the right to leave, even if it destroys you. Until this moment, Rochester had been unconsciously trying to outrun the fear of abandonment through control. Jane does what his psyche had absolutely not anticipated. She sustains his love and leaves anyway. It is from this rupture that a different form of closeness between them first becomes possible. Their bond becomes as deep as it does not only because of love or intellectual compatibility. Gradually, their relationship begins to perform a far more complex psychological function. Each compensates for the other's psychic deficits. In object relations theory, the psychoanalytic tradition concerned with internal models of closeness, these kinds of unions frequently form between people whose emotional structures fit together at their extremes. This is precisely what happens between Jane and Rochester. Rochester's psyche is organized around chronic internal instability. He tolerates anxiety, emotional ambiguity, and distance very poorly. His state oscillates constantly between the need for closeness and fear of it, producing the disorganization characteristic of him, the chaotic alternation of candor and manipulation, vulnerability and pressure, emotional pull, and the attempt to maintain command of the situation. He simultaneously craves being truly seen and is terrified of becoming dependent on anyone. Behind the charisma and the theatricality, Rochester carries profound internal shame. He doesn't believe he can be loved without conditions, without power, without emotional superiority. Which is why he has spent years maintaining a persona, the Jungian term for the social mask through which a person regulates their relationship with the world. In Rochester's case, this persona is built around the image of the strong, cynical, dangerous man who controls the space and the emotional dynamic of every contact. Beside Jane, for the first time, this mechanism begins to fail. Crucially, Jane doesn't enter his usual game. She neither submits to his intensity nor tries to overpower it. She doesn't respond to his persona the way others have. Her attention consistently redirects to the actual person underneath the construction. For Rochester, this is a new psychological experience. He isn't being idealized, he isn't being feared, and no one is buying into the image he's constructed. But he also isn't being rejected. Which is why, beside Jane, his internal splitting begins to ease. In the psychoanalytic tradition, splitting refers to the inability to hold contradictory feelings and parts of the self simultaneously. Rochester oscillates constantly between feeling fundamentally corrupt and needing to feel significant. Between craving love and being convinced that love will inevitably end in humiliation or betrayal. Jane is the first person to sustain this complexity without trying to reduce him to either monster or romantic hero, and this gradually makes his psyche more stable. But the dynamic runs in both directions. If Rochester's problem is the inability to regulate emotional intensity, Jane's is the opposite. She has become pathologically good at suppressing herself. Her personality formed in conditions of chronic emotional deficit, where desire, attachment, and the need for recognition had to be kept under constant control. The result is a pronounced emotional asceticism, a form of psychological adaptation in which a person exists through self-restraint, internal discipline, and the suppression of impulse. This is most visible in how she handles her own feelings. Jane perpetually observes herself, analyzes herself, monitors herself. Even at moments of intense emotional engagement, her psyche maintains an internal distance. For her, desire has long been experienced as something dangerous, something that could lead to humiliation, dependency, or the loss of dignity. Which is precisely why Rochester becomes such a significant figure for her. He draws out the suppressed parts of her personality, sexuality, jealousy, emotional hunger, the need to be chosen and wanted. But something else matters even more. Beside him, Jane begins for the first time to experience her own subjecthood. For someone who grew up in the experience of continuous depersonalization, this is enormous. Rochester speaks to her as an intellectual equal. He constantly attempts to penetrate her inner world, sees her as a distinct person rather than a convenient function. For Jane, this is practically a new mode of existence. For the first time, her inner complexity doesn't require perpetual self-contraction. Beside Rochester, she stops existing only as the convenient person, quiet, disciplined, invisible. He constantly draws her into a more alive and present state. This is why their bond is for Jane not only a source of risk, but an experience of genuine expansion. And so their connection acquires its full force. They begin to regulate each other's extremes. Rochester reduces her pathological self-erasure and draws her out of emotional numbness. Jane, in turn, begins to perform for him the function of a container. In object relations theory, containment refers to the capacity of one person to hold another's intense emotions without being destabilized, without responding with matching chaos. Jane isn't frightened by his affects, doesn't amplify the drama reflexively, and doesn't lose the ability to see the situation whole. For a psyche accustomed to either conflict or emotional performance, this is close to a unique experience. But it is precisely here that the central danger of their bond emerges. Relationships in which partners begin to regulate each other's psyches, this deeply very easily cross the line between intimacy and emotional merger. Especially when both people carry the weight of chronic inner loneliness. Gradually, the other begins to be experienced not simply as a loved person, but as a necessary condition for one's own psychic stability. This is the state their relationship is dangerously approaching, before Jane's flight from Thornfield. As long as Rochester is unconsciously trying to secure closeness through control, and Jane is gradually becoming the primary regulator of his internal state. Their bond is moving, inevitably toward absorption. Only the catastrophe that destroys the old power structure between them allows the relationship to take a different form. The ending of Jane and Rochester's story is psychologically far more complex than it is usually presented. The narrative after Ferndean is commonly read as a conventional romantic resolution. The hero suffers, is punished, is transformed, and love finally becomes right and harmonious. But Brontë isn't writing about perfect healing. She shows a far more realistic, and for that reason more unsettling, process. Two deeply traumatized people trying to build closeness after the destruction of the old system of power and emotional absorption. Their relationship genuinely becomes healthier. The atmosphere of constant psychological pressure dissolves, along with the emotional spectacles, the tests, the provocations, the attempts to hold love through control. But the dependency itself doesn't disappear, especially on Rochester's side. Jane remains his central figure of internal stability, the person beside whom his psyche assembles into something more coherent. The difference is that this dependency no longer automatically gives him the right to subordinate another person to his anxiety. This is the essential distinction between pathological merger and a more mature form of attachment. In emotional merger, the other person stops being perceived as a separate subject. Their psyche begins to function as an extension of your own. They are required to stabilize your anxiety, compensate for your inner emptiness, confirm your worth, and continuously provide the feeling of safety. Any distance within this structure is experienced as a near threat to psychic survival. This is precisely what was happening with Rochester in the novel's first half. His love for Jane was constantly entangled with the fear of losing her, and fear of loss triggered control. The stronger the attachment grew, the more urgently he tried to reduce uncertainty through pressure, retention, and emotional manipulation. For Jane, this dynamic was gradually becoming dangerous precisely because of her high capacity for emotional endurance. People like Rochester become most intensely attached to those who can contain their chaos, that is, who can sustain another person's heavy emotions without breaking contact or dissolving into matching disorganization. But here the trap opens. The containing person gradually begins to live in a mode of constant psychic regulation of the other, imperceptibly losing contact with their own needs and desires. This is why her flight from Thornfield was so essential. Jane leaves not only a situation of moral impossibility, she leaves the beginning of her own absorption. And she does it before she can fully articulate what is happening. Her impulse toward flight arises as a psychic reaction to the threat of losing her subjecthood, before she can intellectually name the destructive dynamic she's inside. This is one of Brontë's most precise psychological observations. Sometimes a person cannot yet describe a relationship's destructiveness in any coherent way, but already begins to experience it bodily and emotionally as a survival imperative. After Ferndean, the structure of their bond changes because Rochester confronts, for the first time, the irreducible separateness of another person. Previously, he had been unconsciously managing the fear of abandonment through power. Now that mechanism is dismantled. Jane has already left. She has already proven that she cannot be retained by pity, suffering, dependency, or the sheer force of feeling. And it is this experience that gradually breaks his existing model of intimacy. What's significant is that, in the ending, his constant need to test love disappears. The early Rochester can barely tolerate the ambiguity of attachment. He perpetually needs confirmation. Does Jane love him? Will she stay? Will she reject him? Will she choose someone else? This drives him to continuously manufacture emotional tension and provoke his partner into reassurance. After Ferndean, this anxiety doesn't vanish, but it stops governing the entire system of the relationship. For the first time, he begins to acknowledge that love doesn't guarantee possession of a person, which is why Jane's return carries the weight it does. She comes back to him now not from dependency, not from a lack of alternatives, not from the need to play savior. She returns as a separate person, capable of leaving again. And Rochester is required to exist beside that freedom, without destroying it. For his psychological structure, this is close to a radical rewiring. Brontë doesn't idealize their ending. Between Jane and Rochester, there remains a high degree of emotional fixation. Their bond still carries a strong tendency toward mutual psychological centering, the feeling that the other person is the primary source of inner home and stability. This is especially visible in Rochester, for whom Jane continues to function, in significant part, as his central psychic regulator. And yet the distance between the beginning and end of the novel is enormous. Where their bond was originally built around anxiety, power, and the fear of losing control, there is now a recognition of the other's subjecthood, the capacity to acknowledge that the other has their own will, their own desires, and the right not to belong to you entirely. This is qualitatively different ground. Perhaps this is where Brontë articulates one of the most mature thoughts in the entire novel. Fully autonomous love between people carrying serious trauma is very nearly unattainable. The psyche will always look in closeness for support, regulation, and safety. The problem begins when the fear of loss converts the other person into an object of emotional ownership. Jane and Rochester don't become perfectly healthy, but they travel from destructive merger toward a form of connection in which love no longer requires the erasure of separateness. And this is what makes their ending not a fairy tale, but psychologically convincing. Ferndean in the novel's final movement is not simply the place where the characters are reunited. It is the space in which their entire relationship is rebuilt from the ground up. Brontë understands completely. The bond between Jane and Rochester could not become stable while the old power imbalance between them remained intact. Which is why the novel quite literally annihilates the old system, socially, psychologically, and physically. Before the fire, their relationship was built on a rigid vertical axis. Rochester was the master of the house, the employer, the aristocrat, the older and vastly more experienced man. He set the terms of contact, managed the emotional atmosphere at Thornfield, determined the distance, and constantly shifted the psychological ground. Even when Jane resisted him inwardly, she remained objectively extremely vulnerable, a young governess without money, family, or social weight. This is precisely why the early dynamic between them was so dangerous. Rochester's emotional intensity was superimposed on an almost total asymmetry of power. After Ferndean, that construction collapses entirely. Jane returns not as a dependent girl, but as a financially independent woman with her own inheritance. She is beside Rochester, now not because she has nowhere else to go, but because she chooses to be. This is a foundational psychological shift. As long as a person has no real ability to leave, their consent cannot be considered truly free. Only now does genuine voluntariness appear between them for the first time. Simultaneously, Rochester's own identity is dismantled. Before the catastrophe, he regulated his anxiety through control, charisma, power, and the sheer intensity of his presence. He quite literally occupied all the space around him. His energy overwhelmed, drew in, and subordinated emotionally. After the fire, this system stops working. He can no longer hold anyone through force of personality, status, or physical dominance. More than this, he finds himself for the first time in a position of dependency and vulnerability, the very state that had previously produced something close to panic in him. Here Brontë makes a very precise move. She doesn't simply punish the hero with disability for his moral failures. That would be far too crude for this novel. Rochester's blindness symbolically destroys his former mode of existence. The constant drive to control reality, people, and closeness through external force. At Ferndean he is, for the first time, in a situation where love cannot be secured by power. Which is why the very structure of their contact changes. Before, Jane was constantly having to defend her own subjecthood beside him. Now Rochester is the one who must learn to sustain the subjecthood of another person without trying to subordinate it to his own anxiety. This is most visible in the reunion scenes. The former aggressive intensity is absent. The pressure is absent. The perpetual need to emotionally capture all available space is absent. He no longer tries to psychologically hold Jane at any cost, because for the first time, he has genuinely confronted the idea that another person cannot be made into an extension of your own psyche. It's important to be clear. This equilibrium doesn't make their relationship simple or fully psychologically healthy. Between them, there remains a high degree of emotional fixation and mutual significance. The bond simply no longer organizes itself around a vertical of dominance. Love no longer functions as an instrument of power. This is also where the comparison with Darcy and Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice becomes interesting. These pairs are frequently set beside each other as the two great romantic unions of 19th century English literature. But psychologically, they occupy entirely different terrain. In Austen, the relationship is considerably more stable from the outset. Darcy is not a man with serious internal splitting, disorganized attachment, or the terror of emotional absorption. His problem is pride, class blindness, and emotional reserve. He can be arrogant, but his personality remains internally whole. He doesn't need to pass through the total annihilation of his own identity in order to learn closeness. In Brontë, everything is differently constructed. Her novel is built around trauma, chronic loneliness, the fear of intimacy, and the struggle for selfhood inside love. Here the relationship doesn't develop through the gradual correction of character. It develops through psychological catastrophe. Which is why the story of Jane and Rochester feels so intense even now. This is no longer a novel about overcoming misunderstanding or social prejudice. It's a story about what happens when love collides with internal chaos, power, dependency, and the terror of being left. And Brontë brings her characters to a very hard conclusion. Sometimes it is not enough to simply understand your mistakes. Sometimes the old structure of a relationship must be completely destroyed. Otherwise, people go on loving each other through control, fear, and the attempt to emotionally possess what cannot be possessed. The Rochester phenomenon long ago outgrew the boundaries of literary analysis. He continues to be received as the archetype of the real man, complex, dark, emotionally intense, capable of enormous love. The problem here is not that readers have misread Brontë. Rochester is genuinely psychologically compelling. More than this, Brontë makes him so deliberately. Against emotionally sterile or socially predictable men, he registers as alive. There is constant internal movement in him: pain, sarcasm, tenderness, aggression, vulnerability, fear, the suppressed hunger for closeness. His psyche is always in motion. This is exactly what produces the sensation of depth, the feeling that beneath the external roughness lies an enormous inner world that needs to be unlocked and saved. And here the human psyche walks straight into a very common trap. Emotional instability begins to be read as depth of character. This happens constantly, not only in literature but in real relationships. People frequently confuse anxious attachment with intense love, emotional absorption with closeness, jealousy with passion, and psychological dependency with proof of an exceptional bond. Those most vulnerable to this are people for whom love itself, from childhood, was entangled with anxiety, emotional unpredictability, or the need to earn someone's attention. Rochester maps precisely onto this fantasy. His feelings are vast in their intensity. He quite literally centers his psychic life around Jane. She becomes for him a source of stability, a moral anchor, and a way of holding his internal chaos together. This kind of love feels enormous and is therefore easily romanticized. But psychologically, it places an enormous burden on the partner. The early Rochester is someone beside whom you are required to continuously sustain another person's emotional turbulence. His fear of loss rapidly becomes control. Anxiety becomes testing. Vulnerability becomes pressure. He cannot simply love and wait for the other person's response because the ambiguity of closeness is too painful for him. Which is why he perpetually tries to close the distance through emotional action. Provocation, jealousy, dramatization, manipulation, or the construction of a feeling of unique, irreplaceable connection. People like this are genuinely capable of producing the sensation of extraordinary emotional closeness. The problem is that their intensity very easily begins to displace the partner's psyche. Gradually, the relationship begins to revolve around one person: their pain, their crises, their fears, their need for reassurance. This is precisely why Jane's figure is so essential to the novel's argument. The romanticization of Rochester almost always ignores the other pole of the story, Jane's own internal structure. Without it, the entire narrative would end not in transformation, but in psychological destruction. Jane withstands Rochester not because his behavior is safe or cured by love. She withstands him because she possesses an exceptionally stable inner core. Her psyche knows how to maintain separateness inside a powerful emotional attachment. And more than this, it is Jane who, at a certain point, begins to define the moral and psychological limits of the relationship. This is the moment most often lost in romantic readings. Most people remain inside relationships like this precisely because they begin to experience another person's damage as their own responsibility. It seems to them that if they love with enough force, enough patience, enough sacrifice, the other person will change. But in reality, a relationship with someone at the level of the early Rochester can gradually erode a partner's personality, especially if that partner has their own tendency toward emotional merger, toward the rescuer role, or toward chronically placing other people's needs above their own. Brontë understands this completely, which is exactly why Jane doesn't save Rochester with her love. On the contrary, She leaves at the moment when love begins to threaten her own integrity. This fundamentally dismantles the popular romantic fantasy that intense feeling can, in and of itself, heal a heavy psychological structure. Rochester doesn't change because the right woman appears. He changes because his old way of existing stops working. He loses the mechanisms of control, passes through the destruction of his own grandiosity, and for the first time is forced to sustain another person's separateness without trying to subordinate it to his anxiety. Which is why the story of Jane and Rochester continues to grip people nearly 2 centuries later. Not because it offers the fantasy of perfect love, and not because Brontë is selling the dream of saving a difficult man. Jane Eyre remains so powerful because it shows intimacy in all its psychological ambiguity. Their love is built, from the very beginning, not only on closeness but on the fear of loss, on dependency, on the need to find in another person an internal home. Which is why their bond constantly walks the line between love and emotional absorption. Brontë refuses to make this either a beautiful fairy tale or an unambiguous catastrophe. She doesn't show us perfect people who have achieved complete autonomy. She shows 2 deeply wounded people who nonetheless manage, gradually, to relinquish control, to sustain each other's separateness, and to build a form of closeness no longer founded exclusively on fear and power. And perhaps this is what keeps the novel so alive. Because at the center of Jane Eyre sits one of the most powerful of all human longings, the hope that someone will see the full chaos of our inner world, all the complexity and fear and vulnerability and imperfection, and choose to stay.